Hi, everyone. Before we get to today's interview, I just wanted to let you know that we still have 10 days left in our spring fundraising drive, and we are over 70% of the way to our $20,000 goal. If you would like to support this podcast and our training programs and everything else we do at the Institute, please make a donation following the link in the show notes. Thank you so much.
This is Patricia Martin, and welcome to Jung in the World. The collective unconscious is one of Carl Jung's core theories of the psyche. That is, we all share a human experience from the depths of the collective unconscious, which is a dimension of the psyche common to each of us. Animating the collective unconscious are what he called archetypes, universal energies and character types that are sometimes ancient, but always universal. They reverberate within us when we experience them, even when they speak in symbols and alternative codes of conduct. Joining us today is Lewis Hyde, author of Trickster Makes This World, which is considered one of the most authoritative books on the trickster archetype. Lewis Hyde is a poet, essayist, translator, and cultural critic with a particular interest in the public life of the imagination. A McArthur Fellow and former director of undergraduate creative writing at Harvard University, now retired, Hyde taught writing and American literature at Kenyon College for many years. Hyde is a trustee of the MacDowell Foundation and founding director of the Creative Capital Foundation. Lewis Hyde, welcome to Jung in the World.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Your book has become a classic, appearing on reading lists and writing programs and literature programs at universities across the country. What inspired you to focus all of that scholarship on the trickster archetype?
Well, two things. The easiest one is the stories are fun. They're, they're full of humor, and they allow you to indulge in fantasies of disobedience. And those of us who are obedient enjoy that. But there's a second thing, which is this book comes after an earlier book of mine called The Gift. And The Gift is about gift exchange as a kind of property and all the various things that benefit the people who engage in gift exchange. But one of the problems that I don't address in that book is that gift exchange is an economy of groups, and you could be in the group or you could be outside of the group. So, if you're a scientist, and it's a wonderful thing that the scientists exchange their ideas as contributions, but it turns out they're all men and the women are not involved in the exchange, then you might be ticked off. So there are many situations in which gift exchange is a cohesive force for communities, but what if you're outside the community? So even in that book, I got interested in Hermes and the Homeric hymn to Hermes, which I read as a story of an outsider who manages to penetrate a community and make himself a part of it. We could say more of that as we go on, but it's the book Trickster Makes This World is in part an answer to the book The Gift.
That's very interesting because so far what you've kind of hit on are some of the themes that you cover in the book about the trickster is that they are transgressive, meaning they break boundaries, that they are kind of shape-shifty in that they're able to don different identities or bring forward different kinds of arguments to persuade people, and yet you call their gift, it's kind of an ambiguous gift that they have. or an ambiguous talent, I think is the exact term you use. And this got me curious, that talent, albeit ambiguous, seems to be so alluring. Can you explain that?
So let me first give my short definition of a trickster. The trickster is the sacred boundary crosser. So there are always boundaries in this world, things we care about differentiating. Famously, we differentiated male and female, and now there's a lot of debate about that boundary. There's heaven and earth, or heaven and the underworld. There's the sky and the ocean. There's right and wrong. There's left and right. And also groups have a sense of boundary, that there's an edge to my group. There's a sense that there are people inside this edge and there are people outside the edge. So this is a character you find at those edges. And so ambiguity, this kind of means going both ways. Like being ambidextrous is neither left-handed nor right-handed. And so there are many, the larger point here always is that these distinctions sometimes fail us. And this is the character who comes along and pokes at the distinctions to see if they're still useful and valuable. And often they come apart in his presence or her presence. And that turns out to be a useful thing. More globally, the point is that the trickster disturbs structures. And we have to have structure. If you don't have it, you start creating it. But the problem with the structures is that they tend to get old and frail, or they congeal, become rigid. And so you need some force that keeps them flexible, keeps them on their toes, and make sure always that this is the structure that benefits the people who live under it. And if it begins to fail, if somehow this character can get in and wiggle the thing, then maybe that's useful.
Well, you've called to mind the trickster Loki, and he's actually my favorite trickster. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the boundaries that he transgressed and what system he ended up toppling.
So in the Norse mythology, the simplest case is that there are these gods, the Aesir, who live in a guarded heaven. There's a wall around it. Outside the wall are a lot of other beings, including the giants. And the Aesir, these gods, keep themselves eternal by eating occasionally the apples of immortality. So they're sort of food of the gods, which keeps them from time, keeps them from age, keeps them from growing old and gray. And Loki once manages to persuade the woman who manages the garden where the apples of immortality go. He manages to get some of these apples and takes them outside of the garden, not the Garden of Eden, but the Garden of the Aesir. And what happens as soon as these apples disappear from their walled cities, they begin to grow old and gray. And as all of us do when this happens, they begin to panic. And what's happened is that time has entered the Eternals. So Loki, the distinction here is between temporal things and eternal things. And again, it's an important distinction for thinking. And these distinctions always irritate the trickster. He says, really? Is that going to work? You sure that's always the case? So being able to steal the apples of immortality and move them into another realm confuses the distinction, and time enters what used to be thought of as eternals. Actually, in the book, I suggest that the text we have that tells the story by Snorri Sturluson, the sort of Middle Ages assembler of Norse mythology, he himself was a Christian, and in a funny way, he's taking the Norse myths and beginning to move them into a different world. And Christianity is taking over from an older pagan religion. So, that's an example of historical change, which maps a little bit onto the story of Loki. And we can go more fully into another case where one of the immortals, one of the gods, is a character named Balder, who's associated with the sun. So he's the bright, happy, sunny guy. And just to tell this story very briefly, and then we can unpack it later, but he begins to have dreams that some harm will come to him, nightmares. And his mother is upset. So she goes through all of heaven and earth and makes everything swear that they will not harm Balder. Human beings and the gods and the animals and water and fire and stones, everything swears that it will not harm Balder. And so then the gods kind of have fun there. They invent a game in which they test this out by throwing stuff at Balder. They make spears out of metal and they chuck it at Balder, and the spears just drop away because the metal is taken up. And it's not to harm him. They throw stones at him. So this, of course, irritates Trickster, Loki, who disguises himself as a woman, and he goes into the mother, Frigg, and kind of gets out of her. Really, you asked everything in heaven and earth? She says, well, yeah, everything. I didn't ask this mistletoe. It seems so young and harmless. So then Loki goes and finds some mistletoe, and he makes a little arrow out of it. And he comes to where the gods are playing this game of chucking stuff at Balder. And he finds one of them, Hud, standing at the edge who's not doing anything. He says, why don't you throw something at Balder? But he says, well, I'm blind, and besides, I don't have a weapon. So Loki says, well, here, I made you a little weapon. Try this out. So Bud takes the mistletoe dart and throws it at Balder, and it kills him. So we can come back to this, but I mean, there's another example of a trickster taking something that's in one category, immortal, and moving it to another. Balder is now immortal. And this actually is a common theme in love. The trickster stories, they are involved with the creation of death, or the entrance of death into the world.
Well, so the thing that is so appealing to me about Loki, and I want to hear what you have to say when you kind of apply this to other tricksters, is he takes a little piece of insight, a little piece of information, and he figures out how to use it cleverly. Like, who would think of that, right? And he uses it cleverly to his advantage. Where else do you see this, like in other trickster stories?
I mean, what he does is he finds the exception to the rule. He finds the thing that's not covered by the pattern that's supposed to govern this stuff. My book is partly about this mythology, but it's also about creativity. My assumption is that these stories are a model for disruptive creativity. And so I have a group of artists in the book who exhibit some of the traits of these characters. Now, I want to say right away that human beings are not archetypes. If you find somebody who thinks he or she is an archetype, you should get them help. If somebody thinks he's the god of war, or she's the great mother or something, there should be some dialogue. But the archetype is a useful pattern to use to look at particular cases and see some of it fits and some of it. So one of the characters I talk about is Marcel Duchamp. And Marcel Duchamp once made a door in the corner of the studio. And on both the left and the right side of this corner was a door frame. So when you opened the door on the left side, it swung and closed on the right side. And if you opened it on the right side, it swung and closed on the left side. And people say this is probably his response to a aphorism in France, which is, a door is either open or closed. So, that's a statement about a categorical distinction. A door is either open or closed. And what Duchamp does is say, well, how about this door? It's open and it's closed at the same time. So it's, it's a small example. Most doors are not made like this. So here's one door that eludes the definition. And I think this is the kind of intelligence which does that, which takes the binaries and figures out some example that frustrates them. One other quick, I have a whole chapter about Frederick Douglass, the American slave. The simple point at the beginning is in the 1830s, when Douglass was enslaved in the South, the understanding was that slaves did not read and write. It's not just that they were forbidden. The sense was they didn't have capability. So Douglass steals literacy. He finds a book. Well, he has one of his keepers who helps him learn to read, but he finds a book on the street of the Columbian orator and teaches himself how to make speeches. So again, the distinction between black and white is supposed to also be the distinction between literate and illiterate. And Douglass makes himself a character who is a literate black man and therefore throws plantation culture into, it has a panic attack.
Yes. So this idea that there are humans who have qualities of a trickster fascinated me in the book. I was especially intrigued by your discussion of the confidence man. And the confidence man is very much apparent in American culture, going back to early literature in this country. And we could even take it into the present. But I wanted to talk about the confidence man. What is it about the confidence man that is both unique to the character who is being presented? So I'm thinking about P.T. Barnum and Harold Hill from The Music Man. And then there's something about them that's universal.
So one nice definition of the confidence man is that this is not necessarily a thief or a crook. It is somebody in the business of creating belief. There's somebody who gives you confidence, who makes you confident in the story. And then the problem that's asked of you in the face of someone like this is, why should you believe this story? Now, sometimes you should believe the story. We saw the great figures in American history, Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King Jr., were people who were able to give the nation confidence in what they were doing and lead them forward. And their stories endure. Now, we don't normally think of the con man in that regard, but it helps to widen it that way because con men who trick you ask the same question: why should you believe that story? Now, maybe there are two things to say about why that becomes the problem. Certain things need to be in place for a con game to work. And one is you, the mark, has to be willing to believe. I mean, if you're a complete skeptic, you can never be conned. You will also be very lonely.
Right.
Because human society depends on confidence, depends on believing one another. So you have to be ready to believe. And it also helps a little bit for the con game as thievery if you're a little unconscious of the fact that you want to believe, or even if you're a little embarrassed about what you want to believe. If you're asked to believe something having to do with sex or greed, maybe you're a little ashamed of this. It's part of your shadow figure, as the Lemians would say. And so you have to be ready to believe. The second thing that's often needs to be in place is things. It helps if everything is decontextualized. That is, you're trying to read this character. You're trying to figure out what the cues are that will help you decide whether to believe or not. And so you can imagine a small town where nobody's ever left town. Everybody goes to the same church. You went to high school together. Somebody comes up and starts telling you a tall tale. You have a lot of information about it, well, how to figure out if this is a lie or the truth. And the con game in America really historically begins around 1850. There's a famous story about a guy in New York City who would approach people and get them talking about how they were all Christians, and then asked to borrow their watch. And if you loan them their watch, you never see it again. And this was written up in the newspaper. And the newspaper described this man as the confidence man. And Herman Melville then wrote a whole novel. We think that he reads this in the paper and he thinks, yeah, that's an American story. And part of the point is it's set in New York City in the 1850s. So this is a moment in American history when decontextualization was happening rapidly because the cities were growing. And if you're in a big city, walking on the street, you have very few cues that will read somebody. So maybe the final thing to say is, if you are conned, if somebody manages to take your money because you believe the story, there's a promise of a rise in consciousness. You could wake up now. You could figure out how did you not understand the story? How did you not know how to read? What was it about yourselves that you were unaware of? So at their best, the con artists are great teachers. They help you see what you could not see.
I have to say, I was fascinated by the spirit of your book, which is the world needs tricksters because they show us things we're either blind to or we've seen it, but we're in denial about. And yet they can be very pivotal things, you know? And so I'm curious to kind of lean in a little bit to Hermes, which is a favorite of yours, I suspect, because you have written about him twice now. What a large swath of Western culture has Hermes fit into? Can you explain that? Why did Hermes have, as a trickster, play such a large role?
Well, it's a good story.
Oh, there you go.
I mean, the Homeric hymn to Hermes, just to say it briefly, Hermes is the child of a nymph named Maya and Zeus. And, you know, Zeus, the philanderer, just visits her in her cave, and 9 months later, this little baby boy. And so he's an illegitimate child, you might say. And as a baby, he leaves the cave. He stumbles upon a tortoise. He realizes he can make the lyre, the musical instrument, out of the tortoise shell. He kills the tortoise and makes the lyre, and sings a song. And then he puts it aside and he goes and he steals cattle in the herds of Apollo. And he butchers the cattle, butchers 2 of them, and he makes a sacrifice. And he sacrifices to the 12 gods. Now, the joke in this is he wants to be one of the 12 gods. He isn't, in fact. So my analogy is it's like, apparently Walt Whitman, when he first published Leaves of Grass, wrote a few reviews of his own book. So, you know, it's the character who needs a publicist and has to be his own publicist to begin with. So he does this. And then when Apollo finally comes and finds him and captures him and takes him up into heaven and says, this guy's a thief and we got to punish him, Hermes tells these charming little lies. He says, you know, I'm just a little baby. And all I want is, my mother's breasts and a warm place to sleep. How could I possibly have stolen all these cattle? And the gods laugh. It's funny what he does. In a way, he's not really threatening, but he's charming. And then at some point he plays a tune. It's a theogony. It's a song he plays on the lyre, which is tells the story of the gods and how they came to be. And my guess is that this tune includes Apollo, so he's flattering his brother, and includes himself as part of the pantheon. And at the end of it, Apollo is so charmed. He says, "Oh, you can have the cattle. If I could have the lyre." And so forth. And I mean, again, so that's the basic story. I mean, this thing of charming Apollo, I was thinking it's like, Mick Jagger comes and steals your automobile, and you get him and thrown in jail, and he offers to sing for you. And you say, well, okay, let's see. And, his song is so wonderful. You think, well, let the kid out, he's going to make it.
Yeah.
So now this is a long, complicated story. What part of it should we go into?
Well, okay. So when I was traveling through Europe doing some research about a decade ago, I started noticing that the crossroads in ancient cities that have Hermes at the, there's some image of him at the crossroads. And I was just curious about that.
Well, there's a statue called the Herm, which is head of Hermes on the pillar. So Hermes is the god of travel, and he moves from place to place. One thing to say about this is, if you're the god of travel, if you move from place to place, first of all, you're not the character who stays in the hometown all your life and never knows that there are foreign languages, that people eat different food in different places, that marriage customs are different elsewhere. But Hermes is the character who goes to different places, and so knows that culture is local, that the way people behave, the systems they have are contingent. And particularly the language, there's a word of hermeneut, which means an interpreter or something, but actually it comes from Hermes. The hermeneut originally is a translator. So this is the character who knows that there's both French and Italian and English and can translate from one language to the other. That's a hermeneutic act. And it's only people who travel who know this and will have the skill. So then the problem is, when you travel, you're vulnerable. All kinds of horrible things are going to happen to you, particularly your luggage is going to get stolen. So the curve at the crossroads is supposed to, you touch it as you leave town to remind yourself that you're entering Hermes territory. And you have to be conscious. You have to be aware that there are thieves and that people are going to speak French to you.
I see. Well, you've solved that mystery for me. Thank you.
In the Grand Central Station in New York has a Hermes at the top. And I always think, people don't know, you go in there and you get your pocket picked, but that's because you didn't look up and see the Hermes right there, big warning sign, look out.
Right. So there's the tip. There's the travel tip. Pay a moment of homage to Hermes. I want to talk about Shakespeare and Shakespeare's fool character. And I'm just curious, how does do the fools in Shakespeare? Because the truth is they're jesters, or fools, right? Meaning they're, not necessarily of great intellect or might. And yet sometimes they deliver the hardest truths to the protagonist. So do Shakespearean fools size up as tricksters in your book?
I don't have a lot to say about the fool in Shakespeare. The only thing I would say is that when I was looking at some of them, I thought the way to describe them is they're the faithful, unfaithful servant. That is, some of them they're loyal to the king, but they're able to do things the king can't do. So the kind of loyalty of one level and a willingness to be disloyal. The problem with a lot of people who are rulers is that they're bound to be models of good behavior and propriety, abiding by the law. And but it's hard to go through the world that way. So often they have a sidekick. They have a fixer. They have somebody in the court who will take care of some stuff that they otherwise can't. Maybe, one thing I do know about is, Monkey in China. There's a famous, almost endless story called The Journey to the West, in which Tripitaka, who's the monk in China who goes to India to get the sutras and learn about Buddhism and come back. And he travels with Monkey. And the problem is that Tripitaka is too well behaved and too honest and too credulous to make a journey. And so Monkey is the character who is constantly saying, wait a minute, something shady is going on here. So this doubling belongs to the world of the properly behaved character, who may be the king, or and the need for some levity.
So we do not engage in political conversations here, but
Yeah, really?
Not really. No, it's not. It's not our shtick.
Yeah.
However, very much in the news is a former president who the pundits have called out as being trickster in chief. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
I do. So, several things to say. One is the ancient mythology says that you do not put this character in the center of your world. In the Greek case, for example, Hermes is the last born of the 12 gods. And this is because you need structure before you have the need of somebody who's going to disrupt the structure. So you need Apollonian, you need Apollo characters who are going to set some rules and put the world in order before you begin to have some need for a character who will test the rules. It makes no sense at all to put the trickster in the middle, to give the trickster command. So there's a kind of illogic to that. And you're putting your culture at great risk if you try this experiment. Now, another thing to say is that, so the tricksters are shameless characters, and they are liars. And so we have politicians nowadays who are clearly shameless and lying. But a distinction to make is the trickster often tells lies that call into question the categories by which the truth is established. A quick example is I do some stuff with Krishna in India, who is a thief as a child. And his mother goes out of the house and she says, don't, steal the butter. And she comes back and he's stolen it. And he says, how can I steal the butter? Doesn't everything in the house belong to us? So he's taking the category of theft and pestering it and saying, how do you make this distinction between what belongs to us and what isn't ours and it could be stolen? And the same with lying. When Hermes says, I didn't steal the cattle, one funny thing about that story is at the very end, Apollo gives him the cattle. And so at the end of the day, Hermes is in charge of the cattle. Now, once he's made into a herdsman who's in charge of the cattle, he can't steal them. So there's different kinds of lying and shamelessness. Maybe one last example is the characters in my book who are artists who are shameless. These are characters who call into question the category of shame. I'll give one example, which is Allen Ginsberg. When Allen Ginsberg was growing up in the 1950s, there were two things which his culture asked him to be ashamed of. One was his mother, who was schizophrenic, and the other was his homosexuality. In fact, there are letters from Ginsberg's father basically saying, if you're going to get involved in homosexuality and madness, you should kill yourself. I mean, you have to read them carefully, but, it's the father saying, this is out of bounds. And so, partly the simple genius of Ginsberg's life was to say, I am not ashamed. Now, in a sense, this is a person who himself understands what shame is. He changes the face of shame. He changes the categories. He's not somebody who knows no shame. He's somebody who calls into question, has an ethical stand, which will have different categories for shame and shamelessness. The military should be ashamed of itself. So, in all these cases, when I say this character is the sacred boundary crosser, there's something higher going on in the background about the lying and the shamelessness and the theft. It's somehow creative, not destructive. But it's creative in a given system whose maintenance does matter. So if you have a politician whose shamelessness has no purpose except his own ego and power, whose lies have no purpose except in a kind of defense of his narcissism, and who somehow has gotten himself in the middle of things when he should be, in a small town running a gas station. That's just take.
I want to ask you a little bit more about the trickster and creative energy, because I know you have devoted your career to really examining public imagination. And what you're saying strikes me that we expect artists to be transgressive, especially in the 20th century, right? We look now at, Jackson Pollock's work and we say, oh, no brushwork. Here was a man hurling paint onto a canvas in buckets, and that was transgressive at the time. But it also opened us to a completely different view of art and a completely different understanding after World War II of what kind of culture we might be in. And so what I'm taking from your book and from our conversation right now is that, we live in a society where sometimes art is brought into question, like, why do we need that? But I think you're making an important distinction about what art and artists have to bring to the culture. Am I right?
Yes. I mean, both the gift and the Trickster book are about imagination, about creativity. And in the Trickster book, I end up with a kind of, homemade definition of art, which is it's about a kind of working with the joints. So let me set this up. There's a bunch of words in the English language that have AR as the root. Art is one of them, but articulation, arthropod, arthritis, these all come from a root that has to do with the joints of the body. My wrist is an articulated joint. And so when you talk about tricksters as the boundary crossers, you could also say they are characters who are interested in these joints, the places where two things come together and you have a movable joint. And just to take a thing from the Loki story, Loki manages to kill Balder with the mistletoe. The mistletoe has a symbolic meaning. It used to be gathered in Europe at Midsummer's Eve. So this is the summer solstice. It's the moment when the sun turns around in the sky and goes in the other direction. And so if Balder is associated with the sun, turns out the sun turns around sometimes and goes the other direction. It's a jointed heavenly body. And the reason that Balder is, there's a second story relating to the Loki story that comes from the Caucasus, which I won't get into, except there is even clearer that we're talking about a joint. The character in that story who's like Balder is vulnerable at his knees, and the trickster character manages to kill him by attacking the knees. So there you see clearly that if you want to kill an eternal thing, you go for the joints. You go for the knees, or in Balder's case, you go for the place where the sun turns around. So the trickster is interested in the joints, and then we have different kinds of joints. Some joints are stiff, like the joints in the skull after birth begin to harden up, and you get a stiff skull that doesn't flex. And some joints are flexible, and then some joints can come apart. You can get things disjointed. And our word harmony actually is another word that has the AR root. It's an aspirated AR, harmony. Harmony means things where the joints are all nicely fitted together. And disharmony are things where it's disjointed. To take your Jackson Pollock example, you have a sense of art as this is the way art should be made. These are the protocols. These are the rules of the game. This is how paint is supposed to hit the canvas. And he goes for the joints. He changes the way. So this, and again, it's like the trickster characters are interested in finding the joints of our culture and trying to see if they are serving the greater need of the culture, which is to keep us all lively and happy and well fed. And if, in fact, people are exiled, unhappy, and unfed, the trickster will be there to poke at the way the thing is made and take it apart at the joints and reassemble it some other way. And artists do this work.
In fact, it's why they're here. Not just to make things of beauty and to inspire awe, but to really get us to question, well, do we still really value this or that? And to pose the question. So I want to come back to Loki if I can now, because in that myth, the stakes get really high for the culture, for the system of the Norse gods. And there are some things that happen in that myth that have direct application to some of the things that are happening today. And that supports Jung's theory that these stories are universal and they reverberate through everyone's psyche, and everyone has something to learn from them. So I want to go back to Loki and the death of Balder.
The gods get ticked off at Loki for all the different transgressions that he engages in. And finally, they suppress him. They bind him beneath the earth. And I think some poison water or something drops on his head all the time, and his wife has to come and hold a bowl there to keep the poison from hitting him. She has to go away every few hundred years and empty the bowl, and that's when we have earthquakes, so forth. So the binding of Loki, this is a possible fate of a trickster, is to be completely suppressed. Now, in the Norse stories, it isn't told as a cause and effect, but the sequence of the stories has this come before a later story called Ragnarok, which is the death of the gods, in which the world will come apart. And, the sun will turn black, and people will kill their brothers, and the moon will stop right on where it's, and they'll defund the NEA. Everything will go wrong. It's the end of the world. And Loki will emerge finally from his captivity, coming on a ship made from the unclipped fingernails of the dead.
Wow, what an image.
I'll just say my own sense, the unclipped fingernails of the dead. Now, it turns out when somebody dies, their nails and hair continue to grow for a certain period. And when should you stop cutting the hair and clipping the nails to the dead? I think the point is this distinction we make between the living and the dead is a little hard to get exactly where exactly do you draw the line? If the dead person's nails keep growing, you're not dead yet. So Loki on a ship made of the unclipped nails of the dead, sort of an embodiment of the fact that you thought there's a clear distinction here. I'm coming to show you that it's not the case. So, mostly that's the unique part. The only analogy I have of this, it doesn't happen hardly ever that the trickster destroys the world. In fact, the Loki story is the only one I know so clearly. But the analogy I have is, again, to go to Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, I read, the young man Frederick Douglass is a trickster in that he figures out where the boundaries of the system are that makes slavery and civil plantation culture work. And he disturbs them. The consequence of that is the Civil War. And the consequence of that is one hopes, the destruction of plantation culture. So that would be a case, in fact, of a disruptive moment in history where the system falls apart and there are certain change agents who are there to see how the system was made and to take it apart at the joints. So, yes, there's an apocalyptic promise in some of these stories.
But if I remember correctly, the Loki story, a new seed is planted for a new world. And can you go into that?
I've forgotten that, but yes, that's true. The world comes back green.
Yes, and the two people who emerge, it's unclear, emerge or are spared. They must change genders in order to keep the to populate the new world, to make the new world green and lush and populated.
So let's say two things about that. One is, first of all, this is a story that comes from the way far north cultures, where the sun literally dies every year and it disappears. There's darkness for several months. And so it seems to me it's partly a mythology that encodes the fact that, this is a serious place where the world does die, but spring comes. So it's a vegetation myth. It's an agricultural myth. But yes, there's also, in our day of fluid gender, it's a wonderful promise that in fact, one old system of gender hierarchies and gender oppositions and binaries could be taken apart and the world doesn't get destroyed. It seems to, there's a panic attack where people worry that everything's falling to pieces, but in fact, it can be reconstituted with different gender roles. And, when we talk about culture wars, this is one that's going on right now. The attempt, in the southern states, they are making it illegal to help a young person who feels confused about his or her gender to get help. So they are trying to suppress the urge that other people feel to play with these distinctions.
So you've traveled the world, sharing these myths and talking about the trickster. And I know you have other books. And so as we wrap up, Lewis Hyde, it would be the deepest honor to have you back on the show again to talk about another book.
Well, I'd love to come back. I have a book about the need for forgetting. We could talk about forgetfulness as a positive.
Lewis Hyde, thank you so much for sharing time with us and teaching us more about the trickster energy and the archetype of the trickster.
You're welcome. And thank you for your questions.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like more information about training programs, live and self-study courses, archives, this podcast, our blog, or to find Jungian analysts near you, visit our website, jungchicago.org. Thank you to our 2023 donors who gave at the contributor level or above. Barbara Anand, Uni Alka, April Barrett, Arlo Compan, Judith Cooper, Lorna Crowell, David Dalrymple, Kevin Davis, Dr. Peter Demuth, Mary Doherty, Christine Foskett, Britta W. Jacobson, Mary Ann Johnson, Mary W. Liebman, Mona Manning, Patricia Martin, Boris Matthews, Kenny McKee, Sue Rosenthal, David O. Stats, Lawrence C. Tingley, Don Troyer, Robert Ulrich, Alexander Wayne and Lynn Kopp, Gerald Weiner, William Wolfe, and Ellen Young. You can support this podcast by making a donation at our website, jungchicago.org.